Hello everyone, this is Arsala Ruhi, and today we will talk about what are the DPSPs and how it is different from fundamental rights. DPSP are a very important part of the Indian Constitution. You find it in Part 4 of the Indian Constitution under Article 36 to 51. DPSP originally appeared for the very first time in the Spanish Constitution, and Ireland had copied it from there. Later on, India proceeded and borrowed it from the Constitution of Ireland. What are the DPSP? The Subto Committee in 1946 suggested two categories of individual rights. One being justiciable rights with no doubts to be the fundamental rights, whereas non-justiciable ones are DPSP. DPSP are ideals which are meant to be kept in mind by the state when it formulates policies and enacts laws. There are various definitions to DPSP, which are: DPSP are an instrument which are enumerated in the Government of India Act 1935. DPSPs seek to establish economic and social democracy in the country. DPSP are ideals which are not legally enforceable by the courts for their violation. Facts about DPSPs are: a new DPSP under Article 38 was added by the 44th Amendment Act 1978, which requires the state to minimize inequalities in income, status, facilities, and opportunities. The 86th Amendment Act of 2002 changed the subject matter of the Article 45 and made elementary education a fundamental right under Article 21A. The amended directive that requires the state to provide early childhood care and education for all children until they complete the age of 14. A new DPSP under Article 43B was amended by the 97th Amendment Act of 2011 relating to cooperative societies. It requires the state to promote voluntary formation, autonomous functioning, and professional management of cooperative societies. The Indian Constitution under Article 37 makes it clear that DPSPs are fundamental in the governance of the country, and it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. But here are some criticisms of DPSP. It has no legal force. DPSP is illogically arranged and conservative in nature. DPSP may produce constitutional conflict between center and state. So there are also some conflict between fundamental rights and DPSPs. To understand the relation between fundamental rights and DPSPs, we have to take a look on the following cases. The first one is Champakam Dorairajan case that was in 1951. The Supreme Court ruled that in any case of conflict between fundamental rights and DPSPs, the provision of the former would prevail. DPSPs were regulated to run as a subsidiary to fundamental rights. Supreme Court also ruled that Parliament can amend fundamental rights through Constitutional Amendment Act to implement DPSPs. The result of this case was that Parliament made the First Amendment Act 1951, the Fourth Amendment Act 1955, and the 17th Amendment Act 1964 to implement some of the directives. In 1967 Golaknath case, the Supreme Court ruled that Parliament cannot amend fundamental rights to implement DPSPs. The result of this case was Parliament enacted the 24th Amendment Act 1971 and 25th Amendment Act 1971, declaring that the power to abridge or take away any of the fundamental rights by enacting Constitutional Amendment Acts. 25th Amendment Act inserted a new Article 31C containing two provisions. The first one was no laws which seek to implement the socialistic directive principles specified in Article 39 shall be void on the ground of contravention of the fundamental rights conferred by Article 14, 19 or Article 31. The second one was no law containing a declaration for giving effect to such policy shall be questioned in any court on the ground that it does not effect to such a policy. In Kesavananda Bharati case 1973, The Supreme Court ruled that the second provision of Article 31C, added by the 25th Amendment Act during Golaknath case 1967, it termed the provision unconstitutional. However, it held the first provision of Article 31C constitutional and valid. The result of this case was, through the 42nd Amendment, Parliament extended the scope of the first provision of Article 31C. It accorded the possession of legal primacy and supremacy to the directive principles over the fundamental rights conferred by Article 14, 19 and 31. In Minerva Mills case 1980, the Supreme Court held the extension of Article 31C made by the 42nd Amendment Act unconstitutional and invalid. It made DPSP subordinate to fundamental rights. The Supreme Court also held that the Indian Constitution is founded in the bedrock of the balance between the fundamental rights and the directive principles. Supreme Court ruling following the case were: fundamental rights and DPSPs constitute the core of the commitment to social revolution. The harmony and the balance between fundamental rights and DPSPs is an essential feature of the basic structure of the Constitution. The goals set out by the directive principles have to be achieved without the abrogation of the means provided by the fundamental rights. Conclusion of this essay is: today, fundamental rights enjoy supremacy over the directive principles. Yet, directive principles can be implemented. The Parliament can amend the fundamental rights for implementing the DPSPs, so long as the amendment does not damage or destroy the basic structure of the Constitution. Thank you so much.